His face froze solid, but he kept climbing to save his friends. Joe Simpson's nose had turned black as charcoal, his lips frozen shut like a broken zipper, but his eyes still moved as he dragged his shattered leg across the glacier ice. 3 days earlier, he had fallen 80 feet into a crevasse on Siula Grande in the Peruvian Andes, after his climbing partner Simon Yates cut the rope connecting them. Simon thought Joe was dead. The fall should have killed him. The broken leg should have finished him. The glacier should have become his tomb. Instead, Joe Simpson crawled 6 miles through jagged ice and razor-sharp rocks, pulling his destroyed body one handful of snow at a time, his face a mask of black frostbite, refusing to die alone in the mountains. Joe Simpson was supposed to be the first person to climb the west face of Siula Grande, a 20,113-foot mountain that had killed every climber who attempted it. He was 25 years old, a mathematics student from Sheffield who spent his summers working construction jobs to pay for climbing expeditions. His hands were already scarred from years of gripping ice axes and jamming them into frozen rock. His fingers had been broken and rebroken so many times that they curved slightly inward like claws. Simon Yates was 21, his climbing partner and best friend since college. They had climbed together across Europe and South America, but Siula Grande was different. The mountain rose straight up from the Andes like a frozen knife blade, its west face a vertical wall of ice that caught climbers and threw them to their deaths. The question that haunted every mountaineer who looked at Siula Grande was simple. Could anyone climb it and live? Joe Simpson believed he could. He was wrong about almost everything else. Before Joe Simpson ever saw Siula Grande, he had already survived things that would kill normal people. At age 19, he had fallen 200 feet down a cliff in Scotland and walked away with only a broken wrist. At 22, he had been caught in an avalanche in the Alps that buried him for 30 minutes before he dug himself out. At 24, he had climbed solo up a 2,000-foot ice wall in Norway during a storm that killed 3 other climbers. Joe Simpson didn't just climb mountains, he collected near-death experiences like other people collected stamps. June 6, 1985, Joe and Simon reached the summit of Siula Grande after 4 days of climbing. They had done it. They had conquered the unconquerable mountain. Joe's altimeter read 20,113 feet. The air was so thin that every breath felt like drowning in reverse. Their water bottles had frozen solid hours earlier. Their food was reduced to half a chocolate bar each. Joe took pictures with a camera that barely functioned in the cold. Simon carved their names into the ice with his ice axe. They had 15 minutes on the summit before the cold would start killing them. They took 12 minutes. Then they started down the North Ridge, the safest route back to base camp. The descent should have taken 6 hours. Instead, it took them into the worst climbing disaster in Peruvian history. The storm hit them at 19,000 feet like a freight train made of ice and wind. Wind speeds reached 80 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Joe and Simon could barely see 3 feet in front of them. They had been climbing for 18 hours straight. Their water had frozen solid. Their food was gone. Joe's fingers had stopped working properly from the cold. The tips had turned white, then blue, then started going numb. Simon's goggles had fogged up completely, turning the world into a blur of gray and white. They were moving blind down a mountain that killed experienced climbers in perfect weather. Joe Simpson stepped onto a section of ice that looked solid. It wasn't. The ice collapsed under his weight, and he fell 40 feet down the mountain face, landing on a narrow ledge with his right leg bent at an angle that legs aren't supposed to bend. The tibia and fibula bones in his lower leg had snapped completely through. The broken ends of the bones stuck out through his skin like white spears. Blood was already freezing on his leg in the sub-zero temperature. He couldn't stand. He couldn't walk. He was trapped at 19,000 feet in a blizzard with a compound fracture and no way to get help. When he tried to move his leg, the broken bones ground together with a sound like breaking kindling. Simon Yates faced an impossible choice. He could stay with Joe and watch both of them die slowly from exposure and starvation. The storm was getting worse. The temperature was dropping. They had maybe 12 hours before hypothermia would kill them both. Or he could try to lower Joe down the mountain using their climbing rope, hoping to reach a place where Joe could somehow survive. Until rescue came. There was no rescue coming. They both knew it. The nearest help was 6 miles away across glaciers and crevasses that would kill a healthy climber. But Simon chose the rope. He chose to try to save his friend instead of saving himself. For 6 hours, Simon lowered Joe down the mountain face, 150 feet at a time. The rope was 300 feet long. Simon would anchor himself to the ice with his ice axe, thread the rope through his belay device, and lower Joe into the darkness below. When the rope ran out, Joe would find an anchor point and signal Simon to follow. Then, they would repeat the process. Joe screamed every time his broken leg hit the ice. The sound echoed off the mountain walls like a wounded animal. Simon's hands were freezing to the metal belay device. Ice was forming on the rope, making it slippery and dangerous. Each lower took 30 minutes. They needed to complete 20 lowers to reach safety. They completed 12. At 11 p.m., Simon lowered Joe over what he thought was another ledge. It wasn't a ledge. It was a cliff. Joe fell into empty space, hanging free on the rope 150 feet below Simon with nothing but air beneath his feet. Simon couldn't see Joe. He couldn't hear him over the wind. He didn't know Joe was hanging over a crevasse that dropped 200 feet straight down into the glacier. All Simon knew was that Joe's weight was pulling him off the mountain. The ice anchor he had built was starting to crack. His belay device was freezing up. His hands were losing feeling. Simon held Joe's weight for an hour and a half. His hands were freezing to the metal belay device. Ice was forming on the rope, making it impossible to grip. The storm was getting worse. Simon's anchor point in the ice was starting to crack from the constant strain. He was going to fall. When he fell, they would both die. Simon tried everything he could think of. He tried to pull Joe up, but the weight was too much. He tried to build a better anchor, but the ice was too hard. He tried to communicate with Joe, but the wind was too loud. He had one option left, the option that would save one life and damn the other. Simon Yates cut the rope. The knife went through the rope in 3 strokes. Joe Simpson fell 80 feet into the crevasse and landed on a narrow ice bridge 150 feet below the surface. The impact should have killed him. The fall should have broken his neck. The landing should have shattered his skull. Instead, he woke up 6 hours later in complete darkness, lying on his back in a tomb of ice. His headlamp was broken. His sleeping bag was soaked through. His water bottle had shattered. He had no food, no shelter, and no way to climb out of the crevasse with a broken leg. He was buried alive in a glacier. Simon Yates spent the night believing he had killed his best friend. He reached base camp the next morning and told their third teammate, Richard Hawking, that Joe was dead. They packed their gear and prepared to leave. According to every mountaineering manual ever written, Joe Simpson was already dead. People don't survive falls like that. People don't survive crevasses like that. People don't survive broken legs at 18,000 feet with no rescue coming. The math was simple. Joe had maybe 24 hours before hypothermia killed him. He had no way to get warm. He had no way to get out. He had no way to get help. Joe Simpson didn't know he was supposed to be dead. He spent his first day in the crevasse trying to climb out. The walls were smooth ice, impossible to grip. His ice axes couldn't find purchase. Every time he tried to put weight on his broken leg, the bones ground together and he passed out from the pain. He had maybe 2 days of body heat left before hypothermia killed him. His lips were already starting to freeze shut. His nose was turning black from frostbite. His sleeping bag was wet and useless. His stove was broken. His food was gone. He was trapped in a hole in the ice with no way out and no way to survive. On his second day in the crevasse, Joe Simpson made a decision that saved his life. Instead of trying to climb up, he would rappel down. The crevasse had to have a bottom. If he could reach the bottom, maybe he could find a way out. It was insane. Every instinct told him to climb up, toward the light, toward safety. But Joe Simpson had stopped trusting his instincts. He tied his remaining rope to an ice screw and lowered himself deeper into the glacier. The darkness got thicker. The cold got worse. The walls got narrower. 40 feet down, he found it. A narrow passage that led to daylight. A tunnel through the glacier that opened onto the surface. Joe Simpson crawled out of the crevasse onto the glacier surface. He was 4 miles from base camp. He had no food, no water, and no working gear. His right leg was destroyed. His face was black with frostbite. His lips had frozen completely shut. He couldn't speak. He couldn't stand. He could barely think. Through the pain and exhaustion, the glacier stretched out in front of him like a white desert. 4 miles of ice, and rock and crevasses that could swallow him whole. 4 miles with a broken leg and no help coming. He started crawling. Joe Simpson crawled for 3 days and 3 nights across the glacier. He moved 20 yards at a time, dragging his broken body across rocks and ice. He ate snow for water. He ate nothing for food. When the pain from his leg became too much to bear, he would pass out for a few minutes, then wake up and keep crawling. His sleeping bag disintegrated from being dragged over sharp rocks. His clothes tore apart. His gloves wore through, leaving his hands raw and bleeding. His broken leg swelled to twice its normal size. The bone fragments ground together with every movement, but he kept crawling. On the first night, Joe's lips unfroze enough for him to speak. The first words he said were, "I'm not going to die. Here." He repeated those words every few minutes as he crawled through the darkness. "I'm not going to die here. I'm not going to die here." It became a rhythm that matched his crawling. Pull forward with his arms. I'm not going to die here. Drag his broken leg behind him. I'm not going to die here. 20 yards closer to base camp. I'm not going to die here. The mantra kept him moving when his body wanted to quit. The glacier was a maze of crevasses and ice falls. Joe had to crawl around obstacles that would have been challenging for a healthy climber. He dragged himself over rocks that tore his clothes to shreds. He pulled himself across ice that cracked under his weight. He navigated by memory and instinct, trying to remember the route they had taken on the way up. Sometimes he crawled in the wrong direction for hours before realizing his mistake. Sometimes he crawled in circles, too exhausted to think straight, but he always kept moving. Joe Simpson reached the moraine, the field of loose rocks at the base of the glacier, on his third day. He was 2 miles from base camp. He had been crawling for 72 hours. His broken leg had swollen to twice its normal size. His face was completely black with frostbite. He couldn't feel his hands or feet. He was dying from dehydration and exposure. But he could see the base camp in the distance. 2 miles of loose rock and boulders. 2 miles of the hardest crawling yet. 2 miles between him and salvation. The moraine was hell. The rocks were sharp and unstable. They shifted under his weight. They cut his hands and knees. They tore his clothes apart. Joe had to crawl over boulders the size of cars. He had to navigate around pits that could trap him. He had to cross streams of meltwater that soaked him to the bone. His broken leg caught on rocks constantly. Each time it happened, the pain was so intense he would black out for minutes at a time. But he kept crawling. Simon Yates and Richard Hawking were burning Joe's gear when they heard someone screaming in the distance. They thought it was the wind. Then they heard it again. Someone was calling Simon's name. The voice was wrong. Too high, too weak, too broken. But it was definitely calling Simon's name. Simon grabbed his headlamp and ran toward the sound. He found Joe Simpson lying in a pile of rocks, his face unrecognizable from frostbite, his broken leg twisted at an impossible angle, barely conscious, but still alive, still calling his name. Joe Simpson had crawled 6 miles in 3 days with a compound fracture, no food, and no water. He had fallen 80 feet into a crevasse and climbed out. He had survived temperatures that killed experienced mountaineers. He had crawled across glaciers that swallowed healthy climbers. His face was destroyed by frostbite. His leg was ruined forever, but he had refused to die. He had crawled out of hell and back to the world of the living. Simon Yates carried Joe Simpson to base camp and then to a hospital in Lima. The doctors who examined Joe said his survival was medically impossible. The compound fracture should have killed him from infection. The hypothermia should have stopped his heart. The dehydration should have shut down his kidneys. The frostbite should have poisoned his blood. But Joe Simpson was still alive, still conscious, still fighting. The doctors said he would never walk normally again. They were wrong. Joe Simpson recovered completely, returned to climbing, and wrote a book about his experience called Touching the Void. The book became an international bestseller. Hollywood made it into a movie. Joe Simpson became the most famous survivor in mountaineering history. He gave lectures around the world about his experience. He wrote more books about climbing and survival. He became a professional speaker and mountain guide. He turned his worst nightmare into his greatest triumph. Simon Yates was criticized by climbers around the world for cutting the rope. They called him a coward, a murderer, a man who abandoned his friend to die. They said he should have found another way. They said he should have died with Joe rather than leave him behind. They were wrong. By cutting the rope, Simon Yates had saved Joe Simpson's life. If he hadn't cut the rope, they both would have died on the mountain face. Joe Simpson knew this. He never blamed Simon for cutting the rope. He thanked him for it. He said Simon had given him the chance to save himself. Joe Simpson returned to Siula Grande in 2003, 18 years after his fall. He climbed back to the crevasse where he had nearly died. He stood on the ice bridge where he had landed, looking up at the walls that had trapped him. The crevasse was exactly as he remembered it, dark, cold, and impossible to escape. But he had escaped. He had crawled out of his own grave and walked back to the world of the living. He had proved that sometimes the impossible is just difficult, in disguise. The doctors who treated Joe Simpson said his survival was medically impossible. The mountaineers who studied his case said his crawl across the glacier was physically impossible. The psychologists who interviewed him said his mental endurance was psychologically impossible. Joe Simpson did it anyway. He didn't survive because he was stronger than other climbers. He survived because he refused to accept that he was supposed to die. He survived because he turned his mind into a weapon against death itself. Joe Simpson's story changed how climbers think about survival. Before Joe, the rule was simple. If you can't walk, you're dead. If you fall into a crevasse, you're dead. If you get separated from your partner, you're dead. Joe Simpson proved that death is not always the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a different kind of fight. Sometimes the only difference between living and dying is the willingness to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless. Joe Simpson's face still bears the scars from his frostbite. His right leg still causes him pain every day. He still has nightmares about falling into the crevasse. But he also has something that no other climber in history has: the absolute certainty that he can survive anything. He fell off a mountain and lived. He broke his leg and walked again. He stared death in the face and crawled away from it. He proved that the human body can endure almost anything if the human mind refuses to quit. Joe Simpson proved that the human body can survive almost anything if the human mind refuses to quit. He turned the worst climbing disaster in Peruvian history into the greatest survival story ever told. He didn't just survive Siula Grande, he conquered it twice. Once by climbing it, and once by refusing to let it kill him. He showed the world that sometimes the mountain doesn't win. Sometimes the man crawls away. The mountain is still there, still killing climbers who underestimate it. But Joe Simpson's story lives on, inspiring climbers and non-climbers alike to keep fighting when everything seems hopeless. He showed the world that sometimes the only difference between life and death is the refusal to give up. He crawled 6 miles through hell to prove that point. He dragged his broken body across a glacier to prove that survival is a choice, not a gift. Joe Simpson's face froze solid, but his spirit never did. That's why he's still alive today, still climbing, still refusing to die. That's why his story will outlive all of us. That's why the mountain couldn't kill him, even when it had every chance to do so. Some people are just too stubborn to die. Joe Simpson was one of them. He proved that death is not the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of the fight back to life.